Germany surrendered. But the suffering was not over. The war ended, but a new nightmare began. Millions of civilians were caught in the fire, raped, beaten, driven from their homes, punished for being German. This is the hidden horror of 1945. In 1945, Nazi Germany fell. But for millions of civilians, the nightmare was just beginning. As Hitler's regime collapsed, ordinary people were left behind. The Allies promised a humane and orderly resettlement of Germans from Eastern Europe. What came instead was blood, chaos, and revenge. The Red Army stormed west, furious, unstoppable. The Western Allies closed in. German cities burned. The countryside became a killing field. Women were raped in daylight. Children froze to death in wooden carts. Entire families were wiped out for crimes they never committed. The dead were thrown out of windows, one survivor said. Mothers gave birth and froze where they lay. Stick around because this video dives into 5 brutal flashpoints from 1945. The massacres, the expulsions, the rapes, the death marches. Chapter 1. The Fall of East Prussia. January to March 1945. As 1945 began, East Prussia, Germany's easternmost province, stood exposed to the full force of the Soviet winter offensive. On 13th January 1945, Marshal Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front smashed through the border, meeting Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian Front from the north. Panic swept the civilian population. Gauleiter Erich Koch had forbidden any evacuation until it was almost too late, and tens of thousands suddenly found the armies at their doorstep. Between 12th January and mid-February, some 8.5 million Germans fled the eastern provinces, often piling into overloaded wagons, carts, or trains, with only what they could carry. Scenes of desperate flight became common. Families with children and their possessions trudged through blowing snow under ceaseless air attack. One refugee later recalled columns of carts moving through blowing snow and icy winds, far too weak to move out of the way if a Russian T-34 tank rolled into their convoy. With overland escape routes severed, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz initiated Operation Hannibal, an unprecedented naval evacuation of soldiers and civilians across the Baltic. Beginning 23 January 1945, hundreds of ships and boats carried refugees from ports like Pillau, Baltisk, and Königsberg toward Pomerania and beyond. In the end, Hannibal saved more than 2 million German lives, as Dönitz later estimated, although conservative historians counted as over 1 million evacuated by sea. At Pillau alone, for example, 265,000 East Prussians reached safety by ship. Even so, not everyone made it. When the liner Wilhelm Gustloff was torpedoed on 30th January, nearly 9,400 civilians drowned in one night. These maritime evacuations were a race against time and icy seas, and many more ran the gauntlet on land. The retreat through East Prussia became a nightmare. German propaganda of the era had warned of Soviet atrocities, and now those fears seemed realized. With the Red Army on their heels, refugees often fled along treacherous routes. One such path was across the frozen Vistula Lagoon toward Gdansk. Wehrmacht pioneers marked a makeshift trail with trees and branches, but under relentless Soviet air attack, it became a killing ground. Artillery shells rained on the brittle ice by day and night. Fighter bombers strafed the columns. Dawn often revealed body upon body, man and horse alike. Only the drawbars of the carriages protruded out of the ice. One witness later recalled, On land, conditions were just as brutal. Overloaded refugee trains clattered out of Königsberg through sub-zero gloom, guards and soldiers obeying stand and fight orders, sometimes strafed wagon trains or blocked roads. One East Prussian remembers entire trains packed with refugees that had to stand for days on end. He described how pregnant women who had given birth had frozen to the floor of a packed freight car, their bodies eventually thrown out the windows. Attacks on civilians were common. Columns of wagons were strafed, and people who could not keep pace simply froze or starved. By late January, even the last refugee trains were gone. The final eastbound refugee train left Königsberg on 22nd January 1945, leaving hundreds of thousands stranded. Estimates suggest the East Prussian population, 2.2 million in 1940, had shrunk to just 193,000 survivors by May 1945. Many of the missing were lost on these death marches and ice crossings. When Soviet tanks finally rolled into East Prussia, they brought fury and vengeance. In city and countryside alike, crimes against civilians erupted. Historian Antony Beevor later noted that in Königsberg, seized on 9th April, the rape of women and girls went unchecked. In fact, mass rape was widespread throughout the province. Witnesses repeatedly described Red Army soldiers as an army of rapists. Natalia Gesse, a Soviet war correspondent present in East Prussia, observed bitterly that the troops were raping every German female from 8 to 80. Later, research supports the scale of this violence. Beevor estimates that at least 1.4 million German women were raped in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia during the spring advance. Many women, old or young, were brutalized, and there are chilling accounts of gang rape and torture. One East Prussian survivor recalled hearing how the daughters of Ernst L. were raped by an entire Russian combat unit in an ordeal that lasted from 8 o'clock in the evening until 9 the next morning. It was the start of a time of terrible suffering. These sexual crimes were often accompanied by murder and pillage. Soviet soldiers frequently fired on fleeing refugees, executing whole families and burning farms. One contemporary report noted that Soviet troops had no qualms about firing on unarmed and helpless refugees. Whole families were murdered and their homes were torched. The desire for revenge, stoked by memories of Nazi atrocities in the Soviet Union, was openly encouraged. Frontline orders and propaganda, for example, Ilya Ehrenburg's exhortation to crush the racial pride of the German woman gave many soldiers license to kill and rape. Even when divisional commanders tried to enforce discipline, they were often themselves implicated or powerless. As one late Soviet soldier cynically boasted, 2 million of our children were born in Germany, a grim acknowledgement of the scale of the assaults on German women. Men were not spared either. German military and Nazi officials caught in the aftermath were shot or rounded up. Throughout East Prussia, Communist Party members, Volkssturm militiamen, and ordinary soldiers were summarily executed or herded into captivity. Soviet and NKVD lists targeted anyone deemed a Nazi or collaborator. By the time the fighting ended, out of over 400,000 German civilians detained by Soviet forces in the region, only half would live to be repatriated. In countless villages, survivors recalled women and children begging in basements for mercy, only to be dragged out and assaulted. Such stories, and the testimony that followed in later decades, confirm that the Soviet conquest brought a vengeance that blurred battle and atrocity. By spring's end, East Prussia lay in ruins. The Red Army had captured Königsberg, renamed Kaliningrad, and conquered the remnants of German resistance by early May. Precise totals are impossible to know, but historians estimate at least 300,000 civilians died in East Prussia from January to May 1945. Official German post-war figures even put total wartime civilian losses in the region, including expulsions, at over 300,000. One measure of the devastation, East Prussia's population fell from 2.2 million in 1940 to just 193,000. By May 1945, towns were shattered, and Königsberg itself surrendered on the 9th of April 1945. After a week of street fighting and farmland lay fallow, Catholic and Protestant churches stood as hollow shells. A population which had stood at 2.2 million in 1940 was reduced to 193,000 at the end of May 1945, Beaver writes. Almost all those remaining were old people, infirm or too isolated to flee. The victors also sought reparations. Soviet authorities rounded up thousands of surviving civilians for forced labor. According to German Red Cross estimates, compiled from Soviet records, roughly 874,000 German civilians overall were deported east as laborers in 1945 to 49, mostly for reconstruction work. Included in this total were people from East Prussia and the other lost eastern provinces. About 39% of those deported, on the order of 342,000, never returned. A West German archive report notes that over 400,000 German civilians from the Eastern Territories were sent to the USSR, with roughly half of them, about 200,000, dying there. The survivors who did return, mostly by 1950, told harrowing tales of hunger, disease, and mistreatment in the labor camps. By 1950, the survivors who had not fled or been deported were eventually expelled under Allied agreements. The German communities of East Prussia, in many places centuries old, were largely driven out. Altogether, roughly 12 to 14 million Germans were uprooted from Eastern Europe in this period, with East Prussia's German heritage effectively erased. Monumental loss of life had occurred on all sides. Even the victors carried blood on their hands. In East Prussia's final winter, a hope for orderly evacuation gave way to chaos and suffering beyond imagining. As one survivor put it, what happened in those months was the start of a time of terrible suffering, a brutal coda to World War II that would shape German memory for generations. Chapter 2, Siege and Siege. The Red Army in Silesia and Pomerania, February to May 1945. The winter of 1945 rolled into Silesia like a tidal wave of fire and iron. Just weeks after the devastation of East Prussia, the Red Army launched a full-scale offensive westward, striking deep into the industrial heartlands of Nazi Germany. Their next target, Lower and Upper Silesia, regions filled with factories, railroads, and hundreds of thousands of civilians who had nowhere left to run. The Soviet Silesian offensive began in earnest in February. Red Army tanks thundered through the snowy plains, smashing through Wehrmacht defenses with a brutality honed in the bloodbaths of Stalingrad and Kursk. German High Command had declared cities like Breslau, today known as Wrocław, a Festung, a fortress to be defended at all costs. But the cost would be measured in civilian lives. By mid-February, Breslau was encircled. The city, once home to over 600,000 people, became a prison. Soviet artillery rained down night and day, leveling homes, schools, hospitals, and churches. Entire city blocks disappeared in minutes. The sound of collapsing buildings and the rumble of tanks replaced the cries of children and the daily hum of civilian life. Inside, panic turned into resignation. Civilians hid in basements and cellars, shivering without food, water, or medicine. Eyewitness accounts recall young mothers boiling wallpaper for its glue in desperate attempts to feed their babies. An elderly survivor years later recalled watching neighbors die one by one in the bombed-out tenement across the street, their bodies stacked in the hallway until soldiers could bury them in shallow, rubble-covered graves. Breslau's mayor, Karl Henke, had issued orders, no surrender. Instead, German forces turned the city into a last stand. From February until early May, the defenders fought from house to house, street to street, using ruined buildings as cover. Casualties mounted on both sides. German losses totaled over 6,000 dead and 23,000 wounded. But the Soviet toll was even more staggering. Over 60,000 casualties in the fight for a single city. Yet numbers tell only a fraction of the horror. Almost 80,000 civilians perished during the siege, most not from bullets, but from hunger, hypothermia, disease, or being buried alive beneath rubble. Corpses lined the snow-covered streets, wrapped in sheets, their faces frozen in terror. The stench of death hovered over the city like fog. By the time Soviet troops breached the last German barricades in early May, Breslau was a ghost town. 90% of it lay in ruins. What hadn't been destroyed by artillery had been demolished by the defenders themselves to clear lines of fire or slow Soviet advance. The city, once known for its bridges and Gothic spires, was reduced to ashes, and those who survived would never forget the cost. While Breslau burned, the Red Army also pressed into Pomerania and East Brandenburg. These were not just battlegrounds, they were homelands. German farmers, teachers, priests, and laborers had lived in these lands for generations. But by March, whole towns vanished under the wheels of Soviet armor. As Soviet forces surged toward the Baltic, villages and hamlets emptied in panic. Civilians packed what they could on carts and bicycles, hoping to outrun the front. Many never made it. In towns like Kolberg and Stargard, Soviet and Polish forces found only elderly residents, the sick and terrified women with children. Soldiers suspecting these civilians of aiding the Wehrmacht sometimes responded with gunfire or summary executions. One Pomeranian woman, then a teenager, later wrote of how her family was forced into a barn along with 30 others. Soviet troops locked the doors and set the structure alight. Only she and her sister managed to escape through a side window. They ran barefoot into the snow, never looking back. Not all violence came from Soviet soldiers alone. Polish partisan and militia groups, emboldened by their new control over former German areas, also took revenge. In some western Silesian towns, Polish units executed captured German officials or civilians accused, sometimes falsely, of Nazi collaboration. There was little oversight and even less mercy. In the chaotic vacuum left by retreating German authority, vengeance filled the void. By April, the writing was on the wall. Germany was collapsing. The Third Reich, once stretching from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, was crumbling into dust. For millions of ethnic Germans in Silesia and Pomerania, flight became the only option. What began as scattered evacuations turned into a mass exodus. Entire towns uprooted themselves. Thousands formed makeshift convoys of carts, strollers, and hand-pulled sledges, inching westward in a desperate bid to reach Allied lines or zones they believed safer. Along the way, death followed. Hunger and cold claimed the weakest. Soviet aircraft strafed columns. Some refugees were robbed by deserters or local bandits. Others, unable to move quickly, were overtaken by advancing troops. In the chaos of retreat, tragedy struck in brutal personal ways. Children were separated from parents, sometimes forever. In one documented case, a convoy was stopped near the Oder River. Soviet soldiers selected several young women from the crowd. They were never seen again. Their mothers, left screaming on the roadside, were shot for resisting. Meanwhile, those who remained in towns and villages were often subject to forced labor, detention, or worse. Soviet political officers and NKVD units moved in, compiling lists of undesirables. Young men were rounded up for deportation to labor camps. Women were expected to serve the occupying soldiers. Elderly and disabled residents were sometimes locked in community halls and left without food or medical care. On May 6, 1945, Breslau finally fell. German resistance crumbled. The once proud fortress surrendered, not with honor, but with exhaustion. Among the last to flee was Gauleiter Karl Hanke, Breslau's Nazi overlord who had insisted the city fight to the bitter end. He attempted to escape disguised as a soldier. Czechoslovak partisans captured and executed him shortly after. Within weeks, Silesia and Pomerania were under Polish control. Soviet commanders handed over administrative authority to the newly forming Polish state, which was eager to repopulate these recovered territories. For the remaining Germans, those who had not fled or been killed, a final order came: leave. Entire communities were marched out. In some cases, residents were given a few hours to gather belongings. Others were told nothing and simply awoke to soldiers at their doors. Train stations filled with frightened civilians, many clutching small children or dragging suitcases through ash-covered streets. Some were sent west to Germany proper. Others died along the way from disease, exposure, or attacks. By 1947, Silesia and Pomerania had been almost completely cleansed of their German populations. Towns were renamed, cemeteries were bulldozed or repurposed. Churches, once filled with German hymns, now echoed in Polish. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was the erasure of a culture. Historians estimate that millions of Germans were expelled from the eastern provinces during these final months and years. While precise figures vary, Silesia alone lost 3 to 4 million residents to either flight or forced expulsion. Pomerania saw similar numbers. Of these, between 500,000 and 2 million died due to war-related violence, disease, and displacement. Behind every number was a story: a mother who froze to death carrying her infant across a frozen river, a grandmother beaten for refusing to abandon her family's home, a boy shot for stealing bread from a soldier's satchel. These were not soldiers. They were not Nazis. They were ordinary people, many of whom had already lost everything. By the end of May 1945, the war in Europe had officially ended, but for the people of Silesia and Pomerania, peace was a word with no meaning. The scars carved into the landscape, burned out homes, mass graves, shattered cathedrals, were matched only by those etched into human memory. The Red Army had claimed victory, but the cost was paid not only in blood and rubble, but in the silence that followed. For decades, the story of these expulsions and atrocities was buried under layers of Cold War politics, nationalist narratives, and the collective guilt of Germany's crimes. Yet truth, like memory, does not vanish. It waits. In the ruined streets of Breslau, in the haunted forests of Pomerania, in the fading photographs of nameless refugees, it remains, and it demands to be told. Chapter 3. The Red Wrath in Berlin, April to May 1945. Berlin, April 1945. The once proud capital of the Third Reich stood on the edge of annihilation. The skies above it no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. Red Army artillery thundered relentlessly from the east, each shell announcing the Soviet arrival like the beating of war drums. Hitler was still alive, holed up in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. But for the people of Berlin, the war was already over. What lay ahead was not peace, but devastation. The final assault on Berlin began on April 16th. Stalin had thrown nearly 2.5 million Soviet troops, along with 6,000 tanks and 40,000 artillery pieces, into what would become one of the most destructive battles in human history. His generals, Zhukov and Konev, competed not only for military glory, but to be the first to reach the heart of Nazi Germany. As these forces clashed with Germany's last defenders, old men from the Volkssturm, teenagers of the Hitler Youth, and shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht, the real victims were often neither soldiers nor politicians, but the city's civilians. Berlin had already suffered years of Allied bombing, but the Soviet invasion brought destruction of a different kind. This was not the clinical terror of a high-altitude raid. This was street-to-street fighting, bayonet charges in ruined houses, tanks firing point-blank into cellars where entire families huddled. Eyewitnesses described the city as a hellscape. Fires raged uncontrollably. Electricity and water systems failed. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the cries of the dying. "Berlin is burning," wrote one German woman in her diary. "The buildings collapse like sand castles, and the dead lie in the gutters, mouths open, as if still screaming." Estimates vary, but tens of thousands of Berlin civilians perished during the final battle. Some were killed by bombs and shells, others by collapsing buildings, starvation, or suicide. Many women, anticipating what was coming, took their own lives before the first Soviet soldiers arrived. And those who didn't, they faced a nightmare from which there was no waking. Among the most harrowing legacies of Berlin's fall was the mass rape of German women by Red Army soldiers. While rape had already been widespread during the Soviet advance through East Prussia and Silesia, Berlin represented the horrific climax of this pattern. Modern historians estimate that between 50,000 and 100,000 women were raped in Berlin alone during those final weeks. And many of those were not isolated attacks, but repeated, often group assaults, sometimes over days. Some women were gang raped in front of their families, others were violated and then shot. There were reports of girls as young as 8 and grandmothers as old as 80 suffering the same fate. Survivors' testimonies are almost unbearable to read. One young woman recalled hiding in a coal cellar with her mother and 2 younger sisters. "The Russians came in, reeking of alcohol," she wrote. "They laughed and chose who would go first. When they were finished, they came back the next day and the next." Another woman, a doctor, documented how a line of wounded female patients, many of them recently raped, waited silently outside her clinic each morning, ashamed, afraid, and unsure if help would ever come. "Some had been raped by 5 men, some by 50, she wrote. Some had lost their minds. What made the horror worse was the systematic nature of the violence. This wasn't just an army out of control. It was vengeance institutionalized. Stalin's propaganda had dehumanized Germans as subhuman monsters. Soviet soldiers were told they were avenging the millions of their comrades and countrymen killed by the Nazis. The more they suffered, the more merciless they became. Even some Soviet officers were appalled. A few tried to intervene, but discipline was often impossible to enforce. The sheer size of the advancing force, combined with years of hatred and trauma, had turned Berlin into a playground of retribution. Some soldiers bragged about their acts. One infamous quote, later echoed by German survivors and even post-war Soviet memoirs, was that 2 million of our children were born in Germany. To the survivors, it was not a boast, it was a curse passed from mother to child. By the end of April, what remained of the German command structure had effectively collapsed. Hitler remained hidden in his underground Führer bunker, increasingly delusional and isolated. He ordered phantom divisions into battle that no longer existed. Civilians were conscripted at gunpoint to fight. SS officers executed those trying to flee. As Soviet troops fought into the heart of the city block by block, Berliners found themselves abandoned, No evacuation orders came. No protection was offered. Nazi leaders, so obsessed with their own survival or their ideological last stand, made no effort to safeguard civilians. Indeed, in many districts, they forbade evacuations, fearing that mass flight would inspire panic or suggest weakness. In the final days of April, mothers wandered through the rubble with children clutched to their chests, looking for shelter or water. Others took refuge in the vast subway tunnels, which were soon flooded with water and corpses. One report tells of an underground station where hundreds drowned as water was deliberately pumped in to stop advancing Soviets. Public executions, especially of suspected deserters or traitors, were carried out by Nazi officers even as the Red Army breached the city limits. The enemy was at the gates, and yet Berliners were still being murdered by their own government. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered, but the suffering didn't end. With no functioning government, no police, no medical services, and a traumatized population, Berlin became a city of ghosts. Survivors walked through the ruins in silence. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to brick powder. Buildings stood like skeletons. The Reichstag, once a symbol of German unity, had been turned into a burned-out ruin. Red Army troops looted freely in the early weeks. Furniture, art, jewelry, and food were all taken. What couldn't be carried was destroyed. Alcohol flowed freely. Discipline was loose. Looting and violence persisted for weeks before some semblance of order returned. For many Berliners, the worst had only just begun. Women now faced unwanted pregnancies from rape. Some resorted to back alley abortions. Others gave birth and placed their babies in orphanages, unable to bear the sight of their child's face. Suicide remained a grim constant. In one Berlin district, city records logged over 1,400 suicides in May 1945 alone. Thousands of German men, meanwhile, were rounded up and sent to Soviet labor camps. Others were executed on the spot, particularly if they were found in uniform or had SS tattoos. By summer's end, Berlin's population, once 2.5 million strong, had been reduced to a fraction. The survivors were scarred in ways physical and emotional. And though the war was over, the memory of what happened in Berlin's final hours would haunt generations. What remains? The fall of Berlin was not just the collapse of a city, it was the collapse of a nation, a regime, and a civilization that had brought Europe to its knees and then been brought down with it. Yet while Nazi Germany's death was necessary, its demise did not come cleanly. It came with the blood of innocents, the bodies of women and children, and a legacy of trauma few dared speak about for decades. For Soviet soldiers, Berlin was the ultimate prize, proof that they had avenged Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad. But victory came at a moral cost. For German civilians, the city's fall was not just a defeat, it was a reckoning. And for the world, it was a reminder that even when tyrants fall, ordinary people often pay the highest price. Chapter 4. Expulsions from the East, Czechoslovakia, and Poland, May 1945 to 1948. In the aftermath of World War II, vengeance swept across Czechoslovakia and Poland like a second war. This time, not between armies, but between neighbors. The people who had once lived side by side were now divided by blood, ideology, and rage. And nowhere was this more brutal than in the so-called wild expulsions. In the Sudetenland and the heartlands of Czechoslovakia, ethnic Germans who had lived in these lands for centuries were suddenly branded as traitors and enemies of the state. Following the horrors inflicted by the Nazis, local resistance fighters and mobs now saw their former German neighbors as symbols of occupation and suffering. One particularly grim episode unfolded in Ústí nad Labem on July 31, 1945. after a munitions depot exploded under mysterious circumstances. What followed was not an investigation, but a massacre. Czech mobs descended on German civilians with iron rods, knives, and fists. Dozens were murdered in broad daylight. Mothers were beaten, men were lynched, children were thrown into the Elbe River. It was not justice, it was chaos, baptized in hate. But that wasn't the worst of it. On June 18, 1945, in Horny Moshtenitz, long after the war had officially ended, 265 ethnic Germans, including 120 women and 74 children, were dragged from a train by Czechoslovak troops. Lined up in groups, they were shot one by one. This wasn't mob violence, it was a state-sanctioned purge. Mass graves later uncovered tell the story that few dared speak aloud for decades. Germany's collapse had opened a floodgate of retribution, and innocent civilians paid the price. To the north, in Poland, a similar purge unfolded under a different name, repatriation. But this was no gentle homecoming. It was an exodus, fast and violent. In cities like Breslau, now Wrocław, Stettin, now Szczecin, and Danzig, now Gdansk, ethnic Germans were given only hours to leave their homes. Entire families were forced out at gunpoint with whatever they could carry. Some were herded onto trains, others joined evacuation columns heading west on foot. Most had no destination, only a single purpose: to escape alive. But the roads were no safer than the cities they left behind. Allied and Polish records detail incident after incident of violence along these escape routes. Bombings, ambushes, beatings, and lynchings were not uncommon. In the confusion of shifting front lines and new Polish administrations, unsupervised Polish militia units sometimes operated with deadly freedom. Accusations of collaboration or hidden weapons were enough to justify summary executions. For thousands of German civilians, the journey west ended not in freedom, but in unmarked graves. By 1950, the numbers told a story of staggering scale. 12 million Germans had fled or been expelled from Eastern and Central Europe. West German estimates later claimed up to 14.6 million, when including late expulsions and second-generation migrants. These were not soldiers, they were civilians, shopkeepers, farmers, school teachers. Many had lived in these lands since long before the Nazis ever came to power. Their homes, possessions, and even graveyards were left behind. In many cases, nothing remained but memories, and those too were soon forbidden by new governments eager to rewrite the past. The human cost was devastating. Deaths from exposure, hunger, execution, and disease are estimated between 500,000 and 2.5 million. Some died on the road, others in detention camps, and still more in the silence of shame, never speaking of what they endured. This was the end of the old German East, an entire culture erased by the same fire that had once consumed Europe. Chapter 5, Internment, Forced Labor, and the Aftermath, 1945 to 1950. For many Germans, the war did not end with surrender. It merely changed form, from open battlefields to barbed wire, from armies to work brigades, from bombs to slow starvation. In the East especially, the victors imposed a new form of punishment, forced labor as reparation, that dragged on for years after the Reich's collapse. In the weeks following Germany's surrender, in May 1945, Soviet authorities began sweeping up thousands of German civilians. They were not all soldiers. Many were craftsmen, teachers, engineers, ordinary people dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Some were accused of being Nazis. Others were simply taken to make up the labor quotas Stalin had demanded from his newly conquered zones. An estimated 874,000 Germans, including women and teenagers, were deported from the Soviet zone of Germany and Eastern Europe to labor camps in the Soviet Union. Their destinations were scattered: the frozen mines of the Urals, the smelting factories of the Donbass, the ruined cities of Ukraine. They were put to work rebuilding the infrastructure destroyed by the Nazi war machine. It was meant to be justice, but in reality, it was a second sentence delivered to the wrong people. One former prisoner, a cobbler from Leipzig, later wrote, "We rebuilt cities we'd never seen destroyed. We paid with our bones for crimes we never committed." Conditions in the Soviet camps were unrelentingly brutal. Prisoners were fed little more than thin soup and crusts of bread. Winters were savage, shelters often unheated, and clothes inadequate. Disease spread like wildfire: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Many prisoners were worked to death or collapsed from sheer exhaustion. According to German Red Cross estimates, of the 874,000 civilians and deportees sent east, at least 342,000 died or disappeared. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Baltics, far from the families who never stopped hoping for their return. Adding to this toll were the Soviet special camps, facilities established to detain ex-Nazis, suspected collaborators, and anyone considered politically dangerous. Many inmates were former officials, but just as often they were civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. In these camps, tens of thousands perished in silence. The suffering of German prisoners of war was equally devastating. At war's end, more than 3 million German soldiers fell into Soviet hands. Many surrendered in the final weeks of battle. Others were captured throughout the Eastern Front. While Allied POWs were usually repatriated within a year, German soldiers faced a far different fate. These POWs were not just imprisoned, they were put to work en masse, rebuilding the very territories they had helped destroy. Soviet policy treated them as both enemies and reparations. From 1946 to 1948, they were used to clear rubble in Stalingrad, dig ditches in Siberia, and repair war-torn infrastructure across the USSR. The cost was staggering. By 1950, according to West German records, 1.09 million German POWs had died in Soviet custody. Soviet archives confirm at least 381,000 deaths in NKVD camps, though independent historians believe the real number is much higher. The survivors, released in waves between 1948 and 1955, returned home to a nation that had moved on without them. Families had remarried. Children had grown up. Entire cities had changed hands. For many, their country was as unrecognizable as their own reflection. One former soldier recalled arriving back in West Germany in 1954 after 9 years in captivity. No one asked us what happened. No one wanted to know. We were just the ghosts that returned. The Western Allies, though far less harsh, also held German prisoners. In France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers and civilians were interned. Most were processed through denazification programs and released within a few years. But not all were treated humanely. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, now aligned with the Soviet bloc, Western zones and mixed camps were often mismanaged. Malnutrition, disease, and sporadic violence led to further deaths. Thousands perished in the early months of occupation due to disorganization and poor planning, rather than deliberate cruelty. While these camps didn't match the brutality of the Soviet Gulag, they left lasting trauma. And for many detainees, guilt and shame became lifelong companions, regardless of whether they had committed any crimes. By the early 1950s, Most of the surviving deportees and POWs had returned home, but the scars, emotional and physical, never left. Some survivors had spent nearly a decade in captivity. Others came back broken, unable to speak of what they endured. Many never told their children the full truth. Germany, for its part, was slow to acknowledge the suffering of its own people in the post-war years. Guilt over the Holocaust and Nazi crimes overshadowed everything else. Public discussion of German victimhood was seen as a distraction, or worse, an insult to the memory of those the Nazis had murdered. It wasn't until decades later that memorials began to appear in German cities. Small plaques, modest statues, faded photographs in museums honoring those who were expelled, imprisoned, and killed after the war was won. In remembering them, Germany did not absolve itself of guilt, but it did reclaim a part of its forgotten history, a story not of innocence, but of suffering, of loss, and of the long road back from ruin. By 1945, the war had ended, but suffering hadn't. Innocent German civilians faced horrors few discuss today. Acknowledge the full truth of history, not to excuse, but to remember. Like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories of war, humanity, and survival. Let their voices never be forgotten.